A very warm welcome. I'm back with my next AngularJS tutorial. It's the tutorial number 11. In the last AngularJS tutorial, we learned about dependency injection in AngularJS and how we can use value recipe and factory recipe to implement dependency injection in AngularJS. Let's see what we learned this time. We learn how to use service recipe for dependency injection in AngularJS, how to use provider recipe for dependency injection in AngularJS, how to use constant recipe for dependency injection in AngularJS. Now let's see first what's service recipe in AngularJS. The service recipe produces a service just like the value or factory recipes, but it does so by invoking a constructor with the new operator. The constructor can take 0 or more arguments which represent dependencies needed by the instance of this type. Let's see how we implement it through the code. So friends, this is the code that I'm going to use to explain service recipe here. As you can see, I have a class constructor defined here which takes a parameter student ID, and then the student ID is prefixed with 2 zeros and assigned to a variable student ID. Then I have defined my application module named myApp. Then I have a value recipe here, student ID, which stores the value 614587. We discussed value recipe in the previous tutorial. And the next I have defined a factory recipe here, formatted student ID factory, in which we inject student ID. So this injected student ID is being used to create an object of this class formatted student ID. So this factory basically creates an object of formatted student ID class and returns it. Then I have defined my controller, student controller. Within it, $scope service is injected. Formatted student ID factory is also being injected inside it. We use formatted student ID factory to return formatted student ID object, and I use the student ID variable and assign it to formatted student ID model property. This model property, you can see I am displaying these properties inside my view. I have deliberately used this factory recipe here to have some clarity on service factory. Now we can simply, so here friends, you can see I have defined my service recipe here. It serves the same purpose as this factory recipe is doing here. So we do not need to write so much code. We just need to add this line and we are done with it. Here, whenever we create an object using new and we are returning it, we will prefer to use service instead of a factory recipe. And let's copy it, paste it here. So now my service is being injected into the controller here. So you can see that I am using my service to inject my controller, and then I am using the property student ID of the object's formatted student ID returned by my service and assigning it to the model property formatted student ID, which is being displayed in the view. Let's see how my page looks. So friends, here's how my page looks. The student ID has been displayed with 2 zeros prefixed. Now let us discuss provider recipe in AngularJS. The provider recipe is the core recipe type, and all the other recipe types are just syntactic sugar on top of it. It is the most verbose recipe with the most abilities. The provider recipe is syntactically defined as a custom type that implements a $get method. This method is a factory function just like the one we use in the factory recipe. You should use the provider recipe only when you want to expose an API for application-wide configuration that must be made before the application starts. So let's see how we implement it through our code. Friends, here's the code for my provider recipe. I've defined my provider recipe here. It's format student ID. Inside it I have declared two variables, is engineering students, which is of type bool now, and then another variable named college name. Then I have defined a function, is engineering student, which simply assigns a value to is engineering students variable. Then I have another function, college name func, which too assigns a value to college name variable. Then finally I have my factory method here, $get, which takes student ID as the value here, the value recipe. It uses this value recipe and creates an object of my class, this class formatted student ID, which returns a value student ID with prefix double zeros, and it simply returns that instance. Now we basically use provider recipe whenever we have to do some configuration before the run phase of the application. As you know, AngularJS application has two phases. The first phase is the configuration phase, which is defined by my config function here. It is, as you can see, it is using format student ID provider, my provider, and this injected provider then finally is used to assign some values, or you can say do some configuration. Here you can see I'm calling the functions is engineering student and college name function and setting the values of these variables here. Inside the config function, when I'm doing my configuration, no value and no service or any value is available inside it. It's only available during the run phase of the application. So whatever configuration you have to do before the run phase, you have to do it inside the config function. So this code represents my logic for assigning values to variables before the run phase. Let's see how my page looks. Friends, here's how my page looks. I'm using my provider recipe to display the values. As you can see, I use the provider service here, format student ID, which is getting injected, and I'm using the student ID property of the object it returns to assign its value to formatted student ID model property, which is finally being displayed in the view. Now let's discuss constant recipe. AngularJS splits the life cycle into configuration phase and run phase, and how you can provide configuration to your application via the config function. Since the config function runs in the configuration phase when no services are available, it doesn't have access even to simple value objects created via the value recipe. Since simple values like URL prefixes don't have dependencies or configuration, it's often handy to make them available in both the configuration and run phases. This is what the constant recipe is for. Let's implement it through code. Friends, here you can see I have defined my constant recipe with the name college name. It holds the value college of engineering. I'm using it inside my config function. I have injected college name constant recipe here, which I am passing into the college name function inside the provider. So here's the difference between the value recipe and constant recipe that can be clearly seen. If I had injected the value recipe here, I wouldn't have been able to use it inside config function. It's simply because it's only available after the configuration phase and during the run phase. But the constant recipe value is available in both the phases, the configuration phase and the run phase as well. And another change that I've made in my code is here I am injecting college name constant recipe value here in the controller, you can see here, and then I am assigning its value to a new defined model property college name here. And I have also added a new row to the table inside the view, and I am displaying the college name model property here. Now let's see how my page looks. So friends, here's how my page looks. You can clearly see that the model property set through the value returned by my constant recipe is being displayed here in the third row of the table as College of Engineering. So it's that easy to use provider recipe, constant recipe, and service recipe in AngularJS. So students, here we saw how we use the constant recipe value during the configuration phase and then in the runtime phase of the application. While if we were using the value recipe, we could only use it in the runtime phase and not during the configuration phase. Friends, I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. Please subscribe, like, and comment. To subscribe, kindly click the red button below the video. I will be back with my next AngularJS tutorial soon. Until then, keep practicing and enjoy. Thank you.